A.O. crowd was static, then silence. Colonel Marks Henley stared at the tactical display, watching friendly blue dots disappear one by one from the screen like dying stars. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the microphone, knowing the words that came next would either save 37 Marines or condemn them to a desert grave. Station, this is Overwatch. We have multiple vehicles down, enemy armor advancing from the northeast. Request immediate close air support, over. His voice carried the weight of 23 years in uniform, but underneath lay something he'd never admit, desperation. Pound stretched across the Syrian valley like a concrete camp, its walls scarred by weeks of artillery. Inside, Bravo Company had been pinned down for 6 hours, their ammunition dwindling as fast as their hope. The enemy had them surrounded, T-55 tanks rumbling closer with each passing minute, their diesel engines growling like predators sending blood. Colonel Rebecca Thorne sat in the cockpit of her A-10 Thunderbolt II, 30,000 feet above the chaos, listening to the frantic radio traffic. Her call sign was Reaper, though most pilots used it mockingly. At 42, she was considered past her prime for combat operation, relegated to training missions and administrative flights. The younger pilots whispered she'd lost her edge after Bosnia, that the brass kept her around out of pity. Heard it all before. Female pilots faced enough skepticism without adding age to the equation. But today, she was the only asset available within range, the only thing standing between those Marines and annihilation. This is Overwatch, Henley's voice cut through her thoughts. We have troops in contact, immediate support required. Grid follows. His fingers danced across the instrument panel with practiced precision. Below her, the twin turbofan engines of her Warthog, as the A-10 was affectionately known, hummed with deadly potential. The aircraft was ugly by any aesthetic standard, built around its massive 30 GAU-8 Avenger cannon like a flying gun platform. 7 barrels capable of firing 3,900 rounds per minute, each depleted uranium shell the size of a ball. Coordinates appeared on her heads-up display. She banked hard left, feeling the G-forces press her into her seat. The desert landscape rolled beneath her wings like a tan blanket stretched to the horizon. Somewhere down there, young Americans were dying while she calculated attack vectors and identified targets. Watch Reaper inbound, 2 minutes out, requesting full target package and friendly positions, over. What she couldn't know was that the mission would either end her career in disgrace, or transform her into a lead whispered about in ready rooms for generations to come. Response came fast, clipped with urgency. Reaper, we have 4 T-55s advancing from grid 41 SMB 12,345 67,890, approximately 2 clicks northeast of friendly position. Danger close authorization granted. Repeat, danger close authorized. Felt her pulse quicken. Danger close meant the enemy was within 600 meters of friendly forces, close enough that her 30 rounds could easily shred American bodies, along with any armor. One miscalculation, one moment of imprecision, and she'd be responsible for a blue-on-blue incident that would haunt her forever. Sended through a layer of thin clouds, the desert materializing below her like a harsh painting, rendered in ochre and shadow. The compound came into view first, a rectangular scar in the sand surrounded by black walls and razor wire. Smoke columns rose from several buildings, and she could see the tiny figures of Marines scrambling between defense positions. She spotted them. 4 Soviet air tanks crawling across the hardpan like mechanical beetles, their main guns elevated and tracking toward the American positions. Behind them, a column of BTR armored personnel carriers disgorged infantry that spread out in textbook assault formation. Well, on targets, she ran mid, her voice stayed despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. 4 tanks, multiple APCs, approximately 60 dismounts, beginning attack run. 10 was designed for exactly this scenario. Unlike sleek fighters built for air-to-air combat, the Warthog was a ground attack specialist, armored against small arms fire and engineered to loiter over battlefields, providing sustained close air support. Its titanium bathtub cockpit could withstand direct hits from 23 cannon fire, and its redundant flight system meant it could continue flying even with significant battle damage. Rolled the aircraft into a shallow dive, lying up on the lead tank. Through her targeting system, she could see the T-55's weathered green paint and the Arabic numerals painted on its turret. Someone's son was inside that steel coffin, following orders just like the Americans below, but war didn't allow for philosophical consideration. Her finger found the trigger for the GAU-8 cannon. Out of the A-10's main gun firing was unlike anything else in modern warfare. From the ground, it resembled a stained metallic belch, a deep BRT that seemed to tear the air itself apart. Each trigger pull released a stream of depleted uranium projectiles traveling at 3,500 feet per second, capable of penetrating the heaviest armor like a hot knife through butter. Its first burst lasted exactly 2 seconds, but those 2 seconds contained 130 rounds of 30 meth. The depleted uranium cores punched through the T-55's frontal armor as if it were cardboard, igniting the tank's ammunition storage in a spectacular fireball that sent the turret spinning 30 feet into the air. Destroyed, she reported, already banging hard right to line up on the second tank. Below, she could see the enemy infantry scattering like ants from a disturbed hill, their disciplined formation dissolving in chaos as they realized they were being hunted from above by one of the most feared aircraft in the American arsenal. The second tank commander had seen his lead vehicle die and was attempting to reverse course, trying to put distance between himself and the circling Warthog. It was a futile gesture. The A-10 could loiter for hours, methodically picking apart ground turrets with the patience of a seasoned predator. Adjusted her attack angle, compensating for the tank's movement. The desert wind buffeted her aircraft slightly, but the Warthog was stable as a rock in the air. She squeezed the trigger again, walking her rounds across the retreating T-55's rear deck where the armor was thinnest. It shuddered under the impact, smoke pouring from its engine compartment. She watched through her targeting pod as the crew bailated out, tiny figures running desperately across the open ground. She let them go. Her mission was destroying equipment, not slaughtering fleeing soldiers. Target neutralized, she transmitted, engaging remaining armor. In the compound, the Marines had stopped shooting. They stood behind their sandbag position, staring up at the sky in amazement as the ugly gray aircraft systematically dismantled the enemy force that had seemed unstoppable just minutes before. Some had never seen an A-10 in action, had only heard stories about the legendary Warthog and its devastating cannon. Sergeant Miguel Vasquez pressed his back against the concrete wall, reloading his M4 carbine with shaking hands. 20 minutes ago, he'd been certain they were all going to die in this godforsaken desert outpost. Now he watched Trey's rounds streak down from the heavens like the wrath of God, each burst obliterating another piece of any hardware. "Jesus Christ," he whispered to his squad leader, Sergeant First Class Deanna Kowalski. "Who the hell is flying that thing?" Kowalski had been in Afghanistan when A-10s had saved her convoy from a Taliban ambush. She recognized the distinct sound of the GAU-8, remembered how it felt to see death approaching in the form of any RPGs, only to watch those threats evaporate under precise cannon fire from above. One who knows their business, she replied, ejecting a spent magazine and inserting a fresh one. Just keep your head down and let them work. The tank tried to find cover behind a rocky outcropping, but the Warthog's elevated position gave Thorne perfect visibility on the entire battlefield. She could see any soldiers attempting to set up man-portable surface-to-air missiles, MAN-PADS, that could potentially threaten her aircraft if she wasn't careful. Consider her tactics, climbing to a higher altitude while maintaining visual contact with the ground. The A-10 sensors could identify and engage turrets from several miles away, well outside the effective range of shoulder-fired missiles. It was a deadly game of cat and mouse, played out across the vertical dimension of the battlespace. Next attack run came from the southeast, using the sun's position to mask her approach. The third T-55 never saw her coming. One moment it was a functioning war machine, the next it was a burning hulk, its ammunition cutting off in a series of secondary explosions that sent debris raining down across a 100-meter radius. TR personnel carriers were trying to withdraw now, their commanders finally recognizing that they'd walked into a killing field with no air cover of their own. But the Warthog was faster than any ground vehicle, and Thorne had all the time in the world to methodically hunt down each target. For a strafing run destroyed 2 APCs simultaneously, the 30 rounds punching through their aluminum armor like tissue paper. The vehicles burned with the distinctive black smoke of diesel fuel and rubber, creating a funeral pyre visible for miles across the desert landscape. All armor neutralized, she reported to Overwatch, engaging remaining infantry position. Followed was a MAC class in precision close air support. Thorne switched to her AGM-65 Maverick missile, using their infrared guidance systems to target any fighting positions that were too close to friendly forces for cannon fire. Each missile struck with surgical precision, eliminating threats without endangering the Marines below. It lasted exactly 17 minutes from her first gun run, the final missile impact. When the smoke cleared, the enemy force that had seemed so overwhelming just a short time ago had been reduced to scattered survivors fleeing across the desert on foot, abandoning their weapons and equipment in their haste to escape the wrath of the circling Warthog. Henley's voice crackled over the radio, and for the first time in hours it carried relief instead of desperation. Reaper, this is Overwatch. Threat neutralized, area secure. Standing work up there. Bravo Cummings sends their thanks. Circled the compound once more, conducting a final battle damage assessment. Below, she could see Marines emerging from their defense positions, moving cautiously across the battlefield to check for wounded and secure or abandon any equipment. Several gave thumbs-up gestures toward her aircraft, tiny acknowledgments that meant more to her than any official commendation ever could. I'll be Overwatch, glad we could help. Reaper returning to station. She banked toward home, climbing back to cruising altitude. Thorne allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The young pilots who mocked her call sign might reconsider their opinions after today. In 17 minutes of combat, she demonstrated why the A-10 Thunderbolt II remained one of the most feared ground attack aircraft in the world, and why experience could never be replaced by youth and arrogance. Satisfaction was a luxury he couldn't afford for long. In the world of military aviation, yesterday's hero was tomorrow's footnote, and she knew that this mission, impressive as it was, wouldn't shield her from the ongoing debates about her future in the cockpit. Flight back to Alda Air Base gave her time to think. Below, the desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a harsh landscape that had claimed the lives of countless warriors throughout history. Today, 37 Americans would go home to their families because of her actions, but tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions about her capabilities. Radio had fallen silent except for routine air traffic control tower. She flew alone with her thoughts, the wind turbofans humming their familiar song. The 10 felt solid around her, comforting cocoon of titanium and aluminum that had carried her safely through another day of combat. 15,000 feet, she could see the coastline approaching, the blue waters of the Persian Gulf stretching toward the horizon like a painted backdrop. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the landscape, reminding her that somewhere far away, it was evening in Nebraska, where her sister would be helping her daughter with homework, living the peaceful life that people like Thorne fought to preserve. About the young Marines she saved today, wondered what they'd tell their families when they called home. Would they mention the Air Force pilot who pulled their bacon out of the fire, or would the story focus on their own courage under fire? It didn't matter. She hadn't flown the mission for recognition or glory. She'd flown it because it was her job, her calling, her responsibility to the people who depended on her. Fell away behind her, replaced by the familiar sight of the airbase's runways and hangars. Soon she'd be back on the ground, filing after action reports and debriefing with intelligence officers. But for now, she was still airborne, still free in the endless sky that had been her home for more than 2 decades. Radio crackled once more. Reaper, this is Aldaf Tower. You're cleared for landing runway 09. Welcome home. It was a word that meant different things to different people. For Thorne, home was wherever her A-10 could land safely, wherever American forces needed protection from above, wherever the sky met the horizon in that perfect line that defined the boundary between Earth and heaven. Began her descent toward the runway, the familiar routine of landing procedures pushing thoughts of combat and mortality to the back of her mind. Tomorrow would bring new missions, new challenges, new opportunities to prove that experience and skill could triumph over youth and skepticism. Night, she would sleep the peaceful sleep of someone who had done her job well, who had answered the call when her fellow Americans needed her most. In the end, that was all any warrior could ask for, the chance to make a difference, to matter, to leave the world a slightly better place than they'd found it. Landing was perfect as always. The briefing took place in a sterile conference room that smelled of stale coffee and recycled air. Thorne sat at a metal table across from Major Trewells, the squadron's intelligence officer, and Captain Jake Morrison, a young pilot who'd been assigned to debrief combat mission. Morrison had the eager expression of someone who'd never been shot at, never had to make split-second decisions that meant life or death for people on the ground. Start from the beginning, Wells said, activating a digital recorder. You received the emergency call at 13:47 hours local time. What was your initial assessment of the tactical situation? Had done this dozens of times over her career. After action reports were necessary but tedious, reducing the chaos and terror of combat to stale prose that would be filed away and forgotten by bureaucrats who'd never smelled cordite or felt the G-forces of a combat dive. The armor elements were advancing on friendly positions, she began, her voice measured and professional. For T-55 main battle tanks, multiple BTR personnel carriers, approximately 60 dismounted infantry, friendly forces were in danger of being overrun. Wilson leaned forward, his notepad ready. He was one of the pilots who'd whispered about her age, though he'd never had the courage to say anything to her face. The danger close authorization, how did that affect your targeting decision? It was a loaded question, and they all knew it. Danger close operations required extraordinary precision. One mistake, one round that strayed a few meters in the wrong direction, and American casualties would be attributed to friendly fire. It was the kind of scenario that ended careers and haunted pilots for the rest of their lives. And her procedures were followed, Thorne replied evenly. I maintained continuous visual contact with friendly positions, used GPS-guided targeting systems, and employed appropriate weapons for the tactical situation. All safe protocols were observed. She didn't mention was the moment of doubt that had flickered through her mind during the first attack run, when she'd seen how close the enemy tanks were to the Marine position. In that instant, she questioned whether she could thread the needle precisely enough to destroy the threats without endangering the friendlies. But doubt was a luxury combat pilots couldn't afford, and she pushed it aside, trusting in her training and experience. She consulted her tablet, scrolling through digital images captured by reconnaissance drones. Battlefield assessment shows 4 tanks destroyed, 6 APCs neutralized, and an estimated 40 enemy casualties. No friendly fire incidents reported. Mission effectiveness rated as highly successful. Was told the story in the cold language of military efficiency. 4 tanks that would never threaten a American position again. 6 personnel carriers reduced to twisted metal. 40 enemy soldiers who'd chosen the wrong side in someone else's war. And most importantly, 37 Marines who would see another sunrise because of her action. But couldn't capture the human element, the split-second decisions, the weight of responsibility, the knowledge that every trigger pull carried consequences that rippled far beyond the immediate battlefield. They couldn't describe the feeling of flying alone above hostile territory, knowing that failure meant watching Americans die while she was powerless to prevent it. Sim cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the question he was about to ask. There's been some discussion about pilot fatigue, the effects of age on reaction time and decision-making. Did you feel any physical or mental limitations during the mission? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Thorne met his gaze steadily, recognizing the challenge for what it was. The young pilots thought she was over the hill, that her reflexes had slowed, and her judgment had been compromised by too many years in the cockpit. They wanted her to step aside, to make room for the next generation of warriors who believed they could do everything better, faster, more efficiently. Thorne met all required standards, she said finally. Mission objectives were achieved with 0 friendly casualties and complete destruction of any target. I believe the results speak for themselves. Nodded, making notes on her tablet. The Marines on the ground submitted a formal commendation request. Staff Sergeant Vasquez specifically mentioned that, without your intervention, Bravo Company would have been overrun within the hour. It was gratifying to hear, but Thorne had learned long ago not to put too much stock in praise or criticism from others. The only opinion that truly mattered was her own assessment of her performance, and she knew she'd flown well today. Not perfectly, no mission was ever perfect, but well enough to accomplish the objective and bring everyone home alive. Briefing continued for another hour, covering ammunition expenditure, fuel consumption, aircraft performance, and a dozen other technical details that would be compiled into reports and filed in databases that no one would ever read. By the time they finished, the sun had set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded her of why he'd fallen in love with flying in the first place. Across the flight line toward the officers' club, Thorne passed her parked on the ramp. The ground crew had already completed their post-flight inspection, refueling the aircraft and reloading its weapon systems for the next mission. Under the hard glare of the floodlights, the Warthog looked exactly like what it was, a machine built for war, ugly and utilitarian, and absolutely deadly when placed in the right hand. Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez, her crew chief, emerged from beneath the aircraft with a wrench in one hand and a satisfied expression on his weathered face. Rodriguez had been maintaining A-10s longer than some of the pilots had been alive, and he took personal pride in keeping his aircraft mission ready. "Did you handle today, ma'am?" he asked, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. Rodriguez had worked on Thorne's aircraft for 3 years, and they developed the kind of professional relationship that existed between pilots and maintainers, mutual respect based on shared competence and dedication to the mission. "Dream," Thorne replied, running her hand along the Warthog's scarred fuselage. The aircraft bore the marks of its service, small dents from debris, fade paint from countless missions, the kind of honest wear that came from hard use in harsh environments. Cannon performed flawlessly, all systems nominal. You keep her running like a Swiss watch. Giz grinned, revealing a gold tooth that glinted in the floodlights. She's got a few more fights left in her, just like her pilot. I heard about today's mission. Word is you saved a whole company of Marines. She traveled fast on military bases, particularly when it involved combat operations. By now, every pilot, maintainer, and support personnel on the base would know about the morning's engagement. Some would view it as validation of the A-10's continued relevance in modern warfare. Others would dismiss it as a lucky break, an exception that proved the rule about older aircraft and aiding pilots. "Doing my job," Thorne said, the standard response of professional military personnel when confronted with praise for successful mission. But Rodriguez had been around long enough to recognize false modesty when he heard it. "With respect, I've been turning wrenches on these birds for 22 years. I've worked with a lot of pilots, good ones and great ones, and a few who had no business in a cockpit. What you did today, that wasn't just doing your job. That was artistry." It meant more to her than the formal commendations and efficiency reports that would follow. Rodriguez had seen hundreds of pilots come and go, had watched young hotshots crash and burn, while experienced hands like Thorne continued to deliver result mission after mission. His opinion carried weight because it was based on observation and experience rather than politics or prejudice. For a few more minutes about maintenance schedules and aircraft readiness before Thorne continued toward the officers' club. The building was a low, concrete structure that had been constructed during the base's initial development, designed for function rather than aesthetics. Inside, the bar was crowded with off-duty personnel unwinding after a long day, their conversations mixing with the sound of a television broadcasting news from home. Ordered a beer and found a quiet table in the corner, content to observe rather than participate in the social rituals of military life. At a nearby table, 3 young pilots were engaged in animated discussion about the day's mission, their voices carrying across the room with the confidence of youth and inexperience. "Heard it was just luck," one of them was saying, a first lieutenant named Bradley who'd graduated from pilot training 6 months earlier. "Right place, right time, nothing more. Anyone could have made those shots." Companion Captain Li Chen shook her head skeptically. 4 tanks in 17 minutes, danger close to friendly position. That's not luck, that's skill. You ever try to hit a moving target from 10,000 feet while calculating wind drift and ensuring you don't kill your own guys? The pilot, Major Tom Stevens, was older and more experienced than his companion, but he still had the eager look of someone building his career. The real question is whether she should still be flying combat missions at her age. It was impressive, sure, but what about next time? Reflexes slow down, decision-making gets compromised. Maybe it's time for some of the old guard to step aside. Sipped her beer, listening to the conversation without emotion. She'd heard similar discussions throughout her career, first about her gender, then about her experience level, and now about her age. The military was a young person's profession in many ways, demanding physical and mental capabilities that naturally declined over time. But it was also a profession that valued experience, judgment, and the kind of institutional knowledge that could only be gained through years of service. Debate about when to retire was one she'd been having with herself for months. She was eligible for full pension, could walk away tomorrow with honor and the gratitude of a grateful nation. She had enough saved to buy a small house somewhere quiet, maybe near the mountains where she could watch the sun set without thinking about threat assessments or ammunition counts. Thing kept her in the cockpit, some combination of duty and pride and love for the work that made civilian life seem pale and meaningless by comparison. Flying was what she did, who she was, the thing that gave her life purpose and direction. Without it, she'd be just another middle-aged woman with too much time on her hands and too many memories of a life lived at full throttle. Phone buzzed with a text message from her sister in Nebraska. Saw the news about something happening in Syria. Everything okay? She'd forgotten that military operations, even successful ones, generated media coverage that filtered back to the civilian world. Her sister wouldn't know details, wouldn't understand that the something in Syria had involved her personally, but she'd know enough to worry. Military families always worried. To back, everything's fine, just another day at the office. Give Emma a hug from her Aunt Becca. It's her niece, 8 years old and convinced that her aunt was the coolest person in the world because she flew airplanes and traveled to exotic places. Emma didn't understand that the exotic places were usually desert wasteland, where people tried to kill each other for reasons she was too young to comprehend. She just knew that Aunt Becca sent postcards from foreign countries and had stories about flying that made her dream of becoming a pilot herself someday. The thought of Em brought a smile to Thorne's face. Maybe that was enough, being a role model for the next generation, showing young girls that they could do anything if they were willing to work hard enough and refuse to give up when things got difficult. Maybe her legacy wouldn't be measured in missions flown or targets destroyed, but in the inspiration she provided to others following in her footsteps. Officers' Club was beginning to empty as people headed back to their quarters or prepared for next shifts. Thorne finished her beer and walked out into the desert night, looking up at the stars that stretched across the sky like scattered diamonds on black velvet. Somewhere up there, satellites were tracking movements across the battlefield, drones were conducting surveillance missions, and other pilots were flying other aircraft on other missions that would never make the news. Or would bring new challenges, new questions about her future, new opportunities to prove that experience and dedication could triumph over youth and skepticism. But tonight, under the vast canopy of stars that had guided warriors and wanderers for millennia, she was content to be exactly where she was. A pilot, a warrior, a guardian of the sky who'd answered the call when her country needed her most. Wind carried the scent of dust and aviation fuel, familiar smells that had become as much a part of her identity as her uniform and her call sign. In a few hours, she'd be back in the cockpit, ready to fly whatever mission the Air Force assigned her. Until then, she'd sleep the peaceful sleep of someone who'd done her due well, knowing that somewhere in a compound in Syria, 37 Marines were sleeping peacefully too because of her action. That was enough, that was everything. Weeks later, the bureaucracy of military life caught up with her. Thorne sat in the stair waiting area outside Colonel James Mitchell's office, reading the same magazine article about military procurement for the third time while her mind wandered to more pressing concerns. Mitchell was the wing commander, a career officer who climbed the ladder through a combination of political skill and careful risk management. Never flown combat missions in the A-10, preferring the glamour and advancement opportunities that came with fighter aircraft. The secretary, a middle-aged civilian contractor, looked up from her computer terminal. Colonel Mitchell will see you now, ma'am. Office was exactly what she expected. Filled photographs of the chain of command, plaques commemorating various achievements, flag stand holding both the American flag and the Air Force banner. Mitchell sat behind an imposing desk, reviewing a file that she suspected contained her personal records and the report from the Syria mission. Seat Rekha, he said, gesturing to a chair positioned directly in front of his desk. The use of her first name was intended to suggest informality, but the physical arrangement of the office, him elevated behind the large desk, her position as a supplement in a small chair, conveyed the real power dynamic. She acknowledged, settling into the chair and maintaining the neutral expression that had served her well through dozens of similar meetings over the course of her career. Closed the file and leaned back in his chair, studying her with the calculating gaze of someone making difficult decisions. I've been reviewing your performance over the past several months, as well as the after-action reports from your recent mission. Outstanding work, by the way. The Marines were very complimentary in their assessment. Praise was nice, but Thorne recognized the setup for what it was. In military conversations, compliments were often followed by criticism or unwelcome news. She waited patiently for the other shoe to drop, her face revealing nothing of her thoughts. Mill continued, right on schedule. I've also been having conversations with personnel at the Pentagon about force structure and pilot assignments. There's growing pressure to transition older aircraft to reserve units while concentrating our active duty resources on new platforms. They wanted to retire the A-10 and pilots like her along with it. The Pentagon had been trying to eliminate the Warthog for years, arguing that newer multi-role fighters could perform the close air support mission more efficiently. It was a debate that ignored the unique capabilities of the A-10 and the irreplaceable experience of pilots who spent decades perfecting the art of ground attack. A-10 continues to prove its value in combat operations, Thorne said carefully. The mission 3 weeks ago demonstrated the aircraft's unique capabilities in the close air support role. Nodded, but his expression remained noncommittal. No one's questioning the A-10's effectiveness in 6 scenarios, but we have to look at the bigger picture: maintenance costs, pilot training expenses, the integrating challenges of maintaining multiple aircraft types. The F-35 program promised to deliver multi-role capabilities that can handle both air-to-air and ground attack missions. 35 Lightning II was the Pentagon's answer to everything. Stealthy, high-tech fighter that was supposed to replace multiple older aircraft types with a single, versatile platform. But stealth came at a cost. The F-35 couldn't carry the massive cannon that made the A-10 so effective against armor, couldn't loiter over battlefields for hours like the Warthog, couldn't absorb battle damage and continue flying like the tame at the cockpit of the A-10. Importantly, F-35 pilots were trained for multiple missions: air-to-air combat, bombing, reconnaissance, electronic warfare. They were generalists in a world that increasingly demanded specialists. The A-10 community, by contrast, had spent decades perfecting the art of close air support, developing tactics and techniques that couldn't be easily transferred to other aircraft or other pilots. In fact, sir, Thorne said, close air support is a specialized mission that requires specific training and experience. The Marines I supported 3 weeks ago didn't need stealth or air-to-air capability. They needed precision firepower delivered by someone who understood ground combat and could operate effectively in a danger-close environment. It was a reasonable argument, but she could see from Mill's expression that the decision had already been made at levels far above his pay grade. He was simply the messenger, delivering news that had been decided by Pentagon officials who never flown combat mission and never had to explain to a Marine's widow why her husband had died because the close air support wasn't precise enough or aggressive enough or timely enough. Understand your perspective, Mills said, but the reality is that we're facing budget constraints and strategic priorities that go beyond individual aircraft or pilot preferences. The Air Force is moving toward a more integrated, technology-focused approach to air combat. Older pilots flying older aircraft didn't fit the Pentagon's vision of modern warfare. They wanted young pilots flying expensive new jets, delivering precision-guided munitions from high altitude while minimizing risk to American personnel. It was a cleaner way to fight wars, more politically acceptable and less likely to generate the kind of messy, close-quarters combat that had defined conflicts like Iraq and Afghanistan. Wars weren't fought in sterile environments controlled by Pentagon planners. They were fought in places like Syria, where American Marines found themselves surrounded by enemy armor and dependent on the skill and courage of pilots willing to fly danger-close missions against overwhelming odds. What are my options? Thorne asked, though he suspected she already knew the answer. Consulted the file again, flipping through pages that contained the bureaucratic detail of her military career, training records, efficiency reports, commendations, and disciplinary actions spanning more than 2 decades of service. Several choices, he said. You can accept reassignment to training position here at the base, working with new A-10 pilots until the aircraft is officially retired. You can apply for transition training to the F-35 program, though that would require extensive retraining and might not be practical given certain factors. A polite way of saying she was too old to start over in a new aircraft, too set in her ways to adapt to different tactics and technologies. The F-35 was a young person's jet, requiring quick reflexes and the ability to process multiple information streams simultaneously. At 42, she was past the optimal age for learning new combat system. Middle continued, you can accept early retirement with full benefits and the gratitude of a grateful nation for your years of distinguished service. It was the end of her career, presented as a choice but really an ultimatum. She could fade away gracefully in a training position where she'd be ignored and marginalized. She could humiliate herself by washing out of F-35 training, or she could walk away with her dignity intact and her reputation unblemished. The options appealed to her, but she was a realist above all else. The military had been her life for more than 20 years, but it was also an institution that moved forward whether individuals wanted to come along or not. Younger pilots were already taking her place, flying new aircraft and developing tactics for conflicts that hadn't yet been fought. How long do I have to decide? She asked. 3 days, Middle replied. Take some leave, think it over, talk to your family. This is a big decision and I want you to be comfortable with whatever choice you make. It was clearly over. Thorne stood, shook Middle's hand with appropriate firmness, and walked out of his office with the same measured pace that had carried her through countless military encounters. The secretary smiled sympathetically. News like this traveled fast through military communities, and everyone would know about her situation within hours. The desert sun was beginning its afternoon descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber that reminded her of why she'd fallen in love with flying. Somewhere over the Mediterranean, other A-10 pilots were conducting training missions or flying combat sorties, continuing the mission that had defined her adult life. Had 30 days to decide her future, 30 days to choose between fading away quietly or walking away proudly, 30 days to figure out who Rebecca Thorne was when she wasn't.